May 7th, 1943, 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Ken Walsh throttled back his Vought F4U Corsair as 3 Mitsubishi A6M0s climbed toward him through scattered clouds. The Japanese pilots had spotted the distinctive inverted gull wings, that bizarre bent configuration that made the American fighter look like a seagull caught in an awkward dive. Walsh could imagine their radio chatter, probably laughing at the strange bird the Americans had sent to fight them. The Zero pilots had good reason for confidence. For nearly 2 years, their aircraft had dominated Pacific skies, with a mystique that bordered on invincibility. Lightweight, incredibly maneuverable, capable of outturning anything the Allies could field, the Zero had become a symbol of Japanese air supremacy. And now here came this oddly shaped American fighter with wings that bent in the middle like they'd been damaged in construction. Walsh waited until the Zeros committed to their attack, watched them separate into their standard 3-plane formation, then he pushed the throttle forward and felt 2,000 horsepower slam him back into his seat. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be repeated thousands of times across the Pacific theatre. The Corsair didn't try to turn with the nimble Japanese fighters. It didn't need to. Walsh dove away, accelerating to over 400 miles per hour, a speed the Zeros couldn't match even in a vertical dive. Then he pulled up in a soaring zoom climb that left the pursuing Japanese fighters wallowing in his wake, their engines gasping in the thinner air. At the top of his climb, Walsh rolled inverted, spotted a Zero still trying to follow, and dove again. This time he came down with his 650 caliber Browning machine guns aligned on target. The Japanese pilot, accustomed to opponents who would turn and fight, never adjusted for the Corsair's speed. Walsh fired a 2-second burst. The Zero's lightweight construction, perfect for maneuverability, offered no protection against the concentrated firepower. The fighter disintegrated, its wing folding back, the fuselage breaking apart, the pilot's body visible for just an instant before the aircraft became a cloud of burning debris. The other 2 Zeros scattered. Walsh didn't pursue. He'd learned the Corsair's strengths and fighting Zeros on their terms was suicide. Instead, he climbed back to altitude and resumed his patrol. Those bent wings, the source of so much initial mockery, had just demonstrated their purpose. They allowed the massive propeller to clear the deck while keeping the landing gear short and strong. They gave the Corsair its distinctive appearance and its deadly effectiveness. The Japanese pilots who survived that encounter would return to base with a new respect for the strange American fighter. Within months, that respect would turn to fear. The Corsair would become known as Whistling Death, the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, a fighter so dominant that Japanese pilots were ordered to avoid engagement when possible. This is the story of how engineering brilliance overcame early disaster, how a troubled aircraft became a legend, and how those mocked bent wings delivered air superiority to the United States across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The Corsair's development began with a 1938 Navy request for a carrier-based fighter that could outperform anything then flying. Chance Vaught's chief engineer Rex Basil faced an impossible equation. The Navy wanted maximum speed, maximum climb rate, maximum firepower, and maximum range, all in an aircraft small enough to operate from carrier decks. Every requirement contradicted the others. Speed required power, power required a large engine required a large propeller, and a large propeller required long landing gear to keep it from striking the deck. Long landing gear meant weak landing gear, unsuitable for carrier operations. Basil's solution was radical. Instead of mounting the wings straight, he bent them downward at the center, creating an inverted gull configuration. This allowed the massive 13-foot propeller to clear the deck while keeping the landing gear short and sturdy. The design also reduced drag where the wings met the fuselage, improving performance. It was brilliant engineering that looked absolutely bizarre. The prototype XF4U-1 first flew on May 29, 1940, powered by the new Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, the same power plant that would drive the P-47 Thunderbolt. On October 1, 1940, test pilot Lyman Bullard pushed the prototype to 404 miles per hour, making it the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The Navy was ecstatic. They had their super fighter, but getting from prototype to combat-ready aircraft would prove nightmarish. The The production F4U-1 that began rolling off assembly lines in 1942 was a maintenance nightmare wrapped in a death trap. The cockpit was positioned far back on the fuselage, 11 feet behind the propeller, giving pilots terrible forward visibility. The long nose made deck landings nearly impossible. Pilots couldn't see the carrier deck during final approach. The aircraft bounced on landing, a characteristic the Navy called porpoising, that could send the fighter careening off the deck. The hydraulic system leaked constantly. The fuel system was prone to vapor lock. The landing gear, despite the inverted gull wing design, was still weak and collapsed frequently. Worst of all, the engine had a terrifying tendency to catch fire during startup. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 was a magnificent engine when running properly, but its 18 cylinders created countless opportunities for fuel to pool during startup. Pilots learned to dread the morning's first engine start, knowing that any day might bring the distinctive whomp of an engine fire, followed by frantic evacuation from the cockpit while ground crews rushed with fire extinguishers. Lieutenant Commander Sam Silber, one of the first Navy pilots to transition to the Corsair, wrote in his flight log in August 1942, "The F4U is the fastest, most powerful fighter I've ever flown. It is also trying to kill me. Today's attempted landing aboard resulted in a bounce that nearly put me in the ocean. The forward visibility is so poor I'm essentially landing blind, using the LSO's paddles and prayer in equal measure. 3 pilots in our squadron have ground looped. 2 have had landing gear failures. 1 suffered an engine fire that burned off his eyebrows. If we can't solve these problems, this aircraft will never see combat," the Navy agreed. In early 1943, they made the humiliating decision to declare the Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations. The fighter designed specifically for carrier operations couldn't operate from carriers. The Marines, desperate for any fighter that could match the Zero, volunteered to take them. The decision would change the course of the Pacific War. The Marines weren't choosy about their equipment. They'd been fighting in the South Pacific with worn-out Wildcats and hand-me-down P-40s, aircraft that were hopelessly outmatched by Japanese Zeros. The Corsair, for all its problems, was faster and more powerful than anything the Japanese had. If it could operate from land bases, the Marines would make it work. Major Gregory Boyington, the legendary Pappy Boyington who would command VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, later recalled his first impression of the Corsair. It looked like somebody had stepped on the wings, this massive engine up front, tiny cockpit way in back, and these ridiculous bent wings. The Marines were joking that Chance Vought had hired drunk engineers, but then they started the engine, and that sound, that deep thundering roar from the double Wasp, that made believers out of everyone. You could feel the power standing 50 feet away. This thing might look strange, but it wanted to fight. The 1st Marine Corsair Squadron, VMF 124, arrived at Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943. The timing was critical. The Guadalcanal campaign had ground through 6 months of savage fighting. Marine and Navy pilots had achieved rough parity with the Japanese through tactics and determination, but they were flying inferior aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, tough and reliable, was 60 miles per hour slower than the Zero and couldn't climb with it. Marine pilots survived through discipline and mutual support, but they needed a fighter that could dominate, not just survive. The Corsair gave them that fighter, once they learned to use it properly. First Lieutenant Ken Walsh, already an experienced combat pilot with kills in the Wildcat, was among the first to transition to the Corsair. His initial flights revealed both the aircraft's tremendous potential and its quirks. The acceleration was phenomenal. The climb rate exceeded 3,000 feet per minute. The top speed approached 420 miles per hour at altitude. The 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, delivered devastating firepower, but the handling required complete relearning of fighter tactics. The Corsair didn't turn well, especially at low speeds. The heavy engine and wing loading meant it needed speed to maneuver effectively. Trying to dogfight a Zero in the traditional sense was suicide. But the Corsair had advantages that transcended turning ability. It could dive faster than any Japanese fighter. It could climb better at high speed. It could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. Most importantly, it had the power to dictate engagement terms. A Corsair pilot could always choose whether to fight or run. A Zero pilot facing a Corsair had no such luxury. The tactical doctrine emerged quickly through hard-won experience. Use speed and altitude. Never get slow. Never try to turn with zeros. Attack in diving passes. Use superior firepower to destroy targets quickly. Then climb back to altitude using excess speed. If a fight went wrong, dive away. The Zero couldn't follow a Corsair in a sustained high-speed dive. The first major test came on May 13, 1943. A flight of 8 Corsairs from VMF-124 intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by over 50 Zeros heading for Guadalcanal. The Americans were outnumbered 6-1. The lead pilot, Captain Jack Conger, took his flight up to 20,000 feet, positioned the sun behind them, and waited. When the Japanese formation passed below, the Corsairs rolled inverted and dove, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. The Zeros, flying escort at lower altitude, never saw them coming. The first pass destroyed 3 bombers and 2 Zeros. Before the Japanese could react, the Corsairs had zoomed back to altitude, their superior power pulling them up and away from the slower Japanese fighters. The Zeros tried to follow but couldn't maintain the climb rate. The Corsairs dove again, this time targeting the scattered bomber formation. 2 more bombers fell in flames. When Zeros finally managed to intercept, attempting to force turning fights, the Marine pilots simply accelerated away, regrouped at altitude, and attacked again. In 15 minutes of combat, the 8 Corsairs shot down 7 bombers and 4 Zeros without loss. More importantly, they'd broken up the attack on Guadalcanal. The remaining bombers, scattered and unescorted, were easy prey for the Wildcats flying lower altitude combat air patrol. Japanese pilots returning to Rabaul reported encountering a new American fighter, extremely fast with bent wings and powerful armament. Intelligence officers were skeptical. Bent wings sounded like combat confusion. But over the following weeks, more reports accumulated. This wasn't confusion. The Americans had deployed something new, Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who had survived the war as Japan's third-ranking ace with 64 kills, encountered Corsairs for the first time in June 1943. His description, recorded in his post-war memoir, captured the shock of facing a superior opponent. We spotted them at 20,000 feet, 6 American fighters with distinctive inverted gull wings. They looked ungainly, almost comical. Our formation of 12 Zeros moved to attack, confident in our numerical superiority and the Zeros' proven superiority over all American fighters. We were about to learn that confidence kills. The Americans didn't turn to fight. They dove away, accelerating to speeds we couldn't match. Then they climbed, straight up, climbing faster than we could follow. At the top of their climb, they rolled over and dove again, this time with their guns aligned. 3 Zeros were destroyed in the first pass. The Americans didn't stay to dogfight. They zoomed away again, regained altitude, and attacked from a different angle. We couldn't touch them. They were too fast, too powerful. When we tried to climb after them, they simply outclimbed us. When we dove to escape, they followed and caught us. It was like fighting ghosts, deadly ghosts with incredibly powerful guns. I hit one Corsair with a good burst, saw my rounds strike the wing and fuselage. The aircraft didn't even wobble. It just kept flying, turned away, and accelerated out of range. That's when I realized we were facing something beyond our experience. This wasn't a better fighter. This was a different category of weapon. The Japanese quickly developed a healthy respect for the Corsair that would evolve into outright fear. Pilots began calling it the Whistling Death, a name derived from the distinctive sound the aircraft made in high-speed dives. The bent wings and air intake design created a characteristic whistle that could be heard from miles away, a sound that warned of incoming destruction. Ground troops reported being able to identify Corsair attacks by sound alone, that rising whistle followed by the hammering roar of 50 caliber machine guns. By July 1943, Japanese pilots were being briefed to avoid combat with the bent-wing American fighters when possible. This represented a complete reversal of the tactical situation that had existed just months earlier. The Zero, invincible through 1942, was now the hunted. But the Corsair's dominance went beyond simple performance superiority. The aircraft's rugged construction gave it a survivability that Japanese fighters couldn't match. The 0800 engine, for all its starting problems, was nearly indestructible in flight. It could run with multiple cylinders shot out. It could lose entire sections of its cooling fins and keep producing power. The engine's 18 cylinders were arranged in 2 rows, which meant that damage to one section didn't necessarily affect the others. Marine pilots discovered they could take tremendous punishment and still make it home. First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who had become one of the Marine Corps' top aces with 25 kills, returned from a mission in August 1943 with his Corsair shot full of holes. Ground crew counted 107 bullet and cannon shell impacts, the rudder was shredded, one aileron was hanging by its hinges. The engine had taken multiple hits, yet the aircraft had flown the 200 miles back to base and landed safely. Hansen's comment to the crew chief became legendary in marine aviation. "You boys build them tough. This thing took everything the Japanese could dish out and asked for more. I think I'll keep it." The Japanese were discovering that shooting down a Corsair required either a catastrophic hit, such as shooting off the tail or destroying the engine completely, or sustained fire that overwhelmed the aircraft's structural strength. Neither was easy to achieve. The Corsair's speed meant engagement windows were measured in seconds. The aircraft's tendency to zoom climb after attacks meant Japanese fighters rarely got second chances. Even when Japanese pilots achieved good firing positions, the Corsair's armour protection, including thick armour plate behind the pilot's seat and armoured glass windscreen, kept pilots alive through damage that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft. The most dramatic demonstration of Corsair durability came on September 11, 1943. Captain Joe Foss, already an ace with 26 kills, most in Wildcats, was leading a 4-plane patrol when they were bounced by a large formation of Zeros over Vella La Vella. In the resulting dogfight, Foss's Corsair was hit by multiple 20mm cannon shells. One shell exploded in the cockpit, showering Foss with shrapnel. Another tore through the right wing, destroying several feet of the outer panel. A third hit the engine, punching a hole in the crankcase and causing catastrophic oil loss. Foss was wounded in the legs and shoulder. His aircraft was on fire. Oil covered the windscreen. The right wing was visibly damaged, with fabric and metal peeling away. By all logic, he should have bailed out. Instead, he stayed with the aircraft. The R-2800 engine, despite losing oil pressure and running with obvious damage, continued producing power. Foss pointed the nose toward base, 80 miles away, and nursed the throttle to keep the engine running. The fire, fed by oil spray from the damaged engine, burned along the cowling but didn't spread to the fuel tanks. The damaged wing, despite missing substantial structure, continued providing lift. 40 minutes later, Foss made a wheels-up landing at the Marine airstrip on Vella La Vella. He was pulled from the burning wreck by ground crew and evacuated for medical treatment. The aircraft was destroyed, but it had brought him home. Japanese pilots, witnessing Corsairs absorb damage that should have been fatal, began to question whether they could win engagements even when they achieved hits. The psychological impact of hitting an enemy aircraft repeatedly and watching it fly away was devastating to morale. By October 1943, the tactical situation in the South Pacific had completely reversed. Japanese bombers required fighter escorts of 30 or more Zeros to have any hope of reaching their targets. Even then, Corsair patrols could tear through the escorts and maul the bomber formations. The Marines were developing the tactics that would define American fighter doctrine for the rest of the war. The standard Corsair patrol consisted of 4 aircraft, flying in a loose finger, 4 formation, a far cry from the tight formations that had characterized early war tactics. This spread formation allowed mutual support while giving each pilot room to maneuver. Flights operated in layers, with some aircraft maintaining high-altitude top cover while others flew lower, ready to intercept threats. When contact was made, Corsairs dove from altitude using speed and surprise to maximize advantage. The boom and zoom tactics perfected by Marine pilots in the South Pacific would be adopted by Army Air Force P-38 and P-47 units, eventually becoming standard across all American fighter operations. Major Gregory Boyington assumed command of VMF 214 in September 1943. The squadron, formed from a collection of replacement pilots and misfits, would become the legendary Black Sheep Squadron. Boyington, a former Flying Tiger with experience fighting Japanese in China, understood the Zero's capabilities intimately. He also understood the Corsair's advantages. Under his leadership, VMF 214 would become one of the highest-scoring fighter squadrons in Marine Corps history. Boyington's tactical philosophy was brutally simple. Use your speed, use your power, use your guns. The Zero can turn inside us all day, so don't turn. Dive on them, shoot them, and get out. If you get slow, you're dead. If you try to dogfight, you're dead. But if you use the Corsair's strengths, they can't touch you. This airplane can outrun them, outclimb them, outdive them, and outshoot them. The only way they win is if we fight their fight instead of ours. Between September and December 1943, VMF 214 shot down 94 Japanese aircraft confirmed, with another 35 probable kills. They lost 12 Corsairs in combat, a kill ratio of nearly 8-1. Boyington personally shot down 22 Japanese aircraft during this period, adding to his 6 kills from his time with the Flying Tigers, making him one of the war's top aces. The squadron's success drew Japanese attention. By December, Japanese intelligence had identified VMF 214 as a priority target. When Boyington led a mission over Rabaul on January 3, 1944, the Japanese were waiting with over 70 fighters. The resulting battle was one of the largest dogfights of the Pacific War. Boyington shot down 3 Zeros, bringing his total to 26 and tying Eddie Rickenbacker's American record from World War I. But then his Corsair was hit by fire from multiple Japanese fighters. The engine quit. Fire erupted in the cockpit. Boyington bailed out and was captured, spending the rest of the war as a prisoner. His loss was a blow to Marine morale, but the Black Sheep continued fighting, eventually being credited with 127 confirmed kills before being rotated back to the United States in January 1944. By early 1944, the Corsair's reputation in the Pacific was established. Japanese pilots called it the most difficult American fighter to combat. Intelligence reports captured later in the war showed Japanese assessments, rating the Corsair as more dangerous than the P-38 Lightning and nearly equal to the P-51 Mustang, high praise considering the Mustang's legendary performance. What made the Corsair particularly feared was its versatility. Unlike specialized fighters that excelled in one role, the Corsair could do everything. It could fly combat air patrol at high altitude, it could escort bombers, it could sweep enemy airfields, and increasingly, it could deliver devastating ground attacks. The F4U's design included hard points for bombs and rockets. Initially, this was almost an afterthought, a way to extend the aircraft's utility. But Marine pilots quickly discovered that the Corsair was an exceptional ground attack platform. The stable flight characteristics at high speed made it an accurate bombing platform. The rugged construction meant it could operate at low altitude in the face of ground fire. And the 6 50 caliber machine guns could shred ground targets with the same efficiency they destroyed aircraft. The standard ground attack load became 2 1,000-pound bombs, or 8 5-inch high velocity aircraft rockets. Combined with the machine guns, a single Corsair could destroy an entire convoy of trucks, flatten a building, or crater an airfield. A 4-plane division could eliminate a small military installation in a single pass. The Marines began using Corsairs for close air support, attacking Japanese positions directly ahead of advancing infantry. The accuracy possible with dive bombing allowed strikes within 100 yards of friendly troops, close enough that Marines on the ground could feel the concussion from bomb impacts. Japanese troops defending fortified positions discovered that concrete bunkers offered no protection against 1,000-pound bombs delivered with precision by diving Corsairs. The psychological impact of Corsair ground attacks matched the terror they inspired in air combat. That distinctive whistle in a dive, now associated with incoming bombs and rockets, became a sound that sent Japanese troops scrambling for cover. Survivors reported that the whistling death ground attacks were more demoralizing than artillery bombardment, because the bombs came with such precision that there was no safe place to hide. During the Bougainville campaign in late 1943 and early 1944, Marine Corsairs provided constant air cover over American positions, while simultaneously pounding Japanese installations. The aircraft's endurance, with drop tanks extending range to over 1,000 miles, meant Corsairs could remain on station for hours. When Japanese aircraft attempted to interfere, the Corsairs dropped their bombs and reverted to fighter role, often shooting down the interceptors before resuming ground attack missions. Meanwhile, the Navy had been working to solve the Corsairs' carrier landing problems. The solution came through a combination of modifications and pilot training. The F4U 1A variant introduced a raised pilot's seat, giving better visibility over the long nose. The canopy was modified with a bulged section that improved rearward visibility. Most importantly, the Navy developed a curved landing approach that allowed pilots to keep the carrier deck in sight until the last moment. By April 1944, the Navy was ready to try again. VF-17, a Navy Corsair squadron, deployed aboard USS Bunker Hill. The results were immediately positive. The modifications and improved pilot training had solved the worst carrier landing problems. The Navy began transitioning fleet fighter squadrons from F-6F Hellcats to Corsairs. Both aircraft were excellent, but the Corsair's superior speed and climb rate made it the preferred choice for fleet defense and strike escort. Navy Corsair squadrons brought the same aggressive tactics that had worked for the Marines. The aircraft's performance advantages over Japanese fighters were just as decisive in the carrier environment. But Navy pilots added new dimensions to Corsair employment, using the aircraft's speed for fighter sweeps ahead of carrier strikes, clearing the way for slower attack aircraft. The effectiveness of Navy Corsairs was demonstrated during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement that American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. While F-6F Hellcats got most of the publicity, shooting down hundreds of Japanese aircraft in the largest carrier battle of the war, Corsair squadrons flying from fleet carriers accounted for over 60 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The battle demonstrated that the Corsair was equally effective in fleet defense as it was in land-based operations. Lieutenant Ira Kepford, flying from USS Bunker Hill, shot down 4 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement during the battle. His combat report described the Corsair's advantages in the massive furball that developed. The Japanese were everywhere trying to get through to the carriers. We dove into the formations from altitude. The speed advantage let us pick targets, shoot, and break away before their fighters could react. I got 1 Val dive bomber, then a Judy, then 2 Zeros that tried to intercept me. The Corsair's guns were incredible. Short bursts were enough. The Japanese aircraft just came apart. We weren't trying to dogfight. We were executing slashing attacks, using speed as both weapon and defense. The Japanese couldn't match it. The battle marked the destruction of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. In one day, the Japanese lost over 600 aircraft and pilots, losses they could never replace. American fighters, including Corsairs, achieved nearly 10-to-1 kill ratios while protecting the fleet from damage. As the war moved closer to Japan through 1944 and into 1945, the Corsair's dominance only increased. Japanese pilot quality decreased dramatically as experienced aviators were killed and replaced by poorly trained recruits. American pilot quality, by contrast, improved as training programs refined and combat experience accumulated. By late 1944, the average Marine or Navy Corsair pilot had over 300 hours of flight time before entering combat, including extensive gunnery and tactics training. Japanese pilots were entering combat with less than 100 hours total flight time and minimal tactical training. The results were predictable. Encounters that might have been competitive duels between skilled opponents in 1943 became massacres by 1945. Japanese pilots in their light, maneuverable Zeros were helpless against American pilots in powerful Corsairs who understood energy tactics and had the training to execute them flawlessly. The introduction of the F4U variant in late 1944 widened the performance gap even further. With a more powerful engine producing 2,250 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, the Dash 4 could reach 446 miles per hour at altitude, making it one of the fastest piston engine fighters of the war. The climb rate increased to over 4,000 feet per minute. Even more impressively, the Dash 4 could maintain high performance at altitudes where Japanese fighters barely functioned. Marine Captain Ken Walsh, who had been flying Corsairs since early 1943, transitioned to the F4U in March 1945. His assessment was emphatic. This isn't just an improved Corsair. This is a completely superior aircraft. The power is incredible. It climbs like it's rocket-assisted. The speed makes earlier models feel slow. I took one up to 38,000 feet and it was still climbing strongly. Japanese fighters can barely reach that altitude, and when they do, they're wallowing. We can fight up there like it's sea level. If the Japanese had any hope of competing before, they have none now. But by 1945, air-to-air combat was becoming rare. Japan's air forces were largely destroyed. Surviving aircraft were being husbanded for kamikaze attacks, one-way suicide missions that represented Japan's desperation. The Corsair's role shifted increasingly to ground attack and close air support for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. At Iwo Jima, Marine Corsairs provided constant air cover during the brutal month-long battle. Operating from escort carriers offshore, Corsairs could reach the island in minutes, attacking Japanese positions with bombs, rockets, and guns. The close coordination between air and ground forces reached new levels of effectiveness. Forward air controllers on the ground could call in Corsair strikes on specific pillboxes and bunkers, with attacks delivered within minutes of the request. The effectiveness of close air support was revolutionary. Japanese positions that might have taken days to reduce with ground forces alone were destroyed in minutes by diving Corsairs. The Marines on the ground gave the Corsair pilots credit for saving countless lives by destroying positions before they could be assaulted by infantry. At Okinawa, the Corsairs' role expanded to include combat air patrol against kamikaze attacks. The desperate Japanese suicide tactics represented a new challenge. Kamikazes didn't try to fight. They simply tried to reach the fleet, and stopping them required destroying every attacker before impact. Corsairs proved ideal for this mission. Their speed allowed them to intercept incoming raids far from the fleet. Their firepower could destroy aircraft with short bursts, critical when facing massive raids with dozens of attackers. Their endurance allowed them to remain on station for extended periods, maintaining protective barriers around the fleet. The statistics from Okinawa demonstrated the Corsairs' effectiveness. Navy and Marine Corsair squadrons shot down over 500 Japanese aircraft during the 3-month battle, the majority being kamikazes. The kill ratio was staggering, often exceeding 20-1. Japanese aircraft were being shot down so quickly that some pilots never even saw the American fighters that killed them, destroyed by long-range fire from Corsairs diving from altitude. Lieutenant Robert Wade, flying combat air patrol from USS Intrepid, shot down 6 kamikazes in a single mission on April 16, 1945. His combat report described the mechanical nature of the slaughter. They came in waves, 40 or 50 aircraft, all headed for the fleet. We intercepted at 15,000 feet 30 miles out. I took the first one with a head-on pass, walked my fire through the fuselage and watched it explode, rolled right, came around on another one, 2-second burst, he went down burning. It wasn't combat, it was execution. They weren't trying to evade, they just wanted to reach the ships. We couldn't let that happen. I got 4 more before I ran out of ammunition and had to return to the carrier for rearm. When I got back, there were still Japanese aircraft in the air. I rearmed and went back up, got 2 more before the raid was over. In 45 minutes, our squadron shot down 31 aircraft. We lost 1 Corsair to ground fire. The pilot was recovered. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Corsair had established itself as one of the most successful fighters of World War II. The final statistics were overwhelming. In air-to-air combat, Corsairs shot down 240 Japanese aircraft confirmed, with hundreds more probable and damaged. The kill ratio was 11-1, among the highest of any fighter in the war. Marine Corsair squadrons produced 17 aces with 10 or more kills. Navy squadrons produced another 10 aces. The top Corsair ace, Marine Major Gregory Boyington, was credited with 22 kills in the F4U, adding to his 6 from the Flying Tigers for a total of 28. But the numbers only told part of the story. The Corsair had transformed the tactical situation in the Pacific from near parity in early 1943 to complete American air superiority by 1944. Japanese pilots who had started the war as the most experienced naval aviators in the world ended it terrified of the bent-wing American fighter that had systematically destroyed their air force. The Corsair's impact extended beyond World War II. The aircraft would serve with distinction in Korea, where it again proved its versatility by excelling in both air-to-air combat and ground attack missions. Marine Corsairs in Korea shot down several North Korean fighters, while also delivering devastating close air support that earned praise from army commanders who'd been skeptical of close air support effectiveness. The French used Corsairs in Indochina. The British Royal Navy flew Corsairs throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Several smaller nations operated Corsairs into the 1960s, making it one of the longest-serving fighter designs of the piston engine era. The aircraft that had been declared unsuitable for carrier operations in 1943 eventually equipped over 20 Navy and Marine squadrons and operated from carriers larger and smaller through the end of the piston engine era. In 1983, at a reunion of World War II pilots in San Diego, former Japanese ace Saburo Sakai met several of the American pilots who had flown Corsairs against him. The meeting was filmed for a documentary. Sakai was asked about the Corsair, and his response captured the complete transformation of perception that had occurred during the war. When we first saw the Corsair, we thought the Americans had made a mistake. The wings looked broken. The design seemed flawed. We were confident we could defeat it just as we had defeated all previous American fighters. We were wrong about everything. The Corsair was not flawed, It was brilliant. Those bent wings allowed it to use a more powerful engine with a larger propeller while keeping the landing gear strong. The design gave it performance we couldn't match. But more than the aircraft itself, the Corsair represented American engineering philosophy. They didn't try to build a light maneuverable fighter like the Zero. They built a powerful, rugged fighter that used speed and firepower to dominate. Once we understood their tactics, we knew we couldn't win. The Corsair could choose when to fight and when to disengage. We had no choice. When the whistling death dove on us, we could only try to survive. Many of my friends didn't. I was shot up by a Corsair in September 1943. I survived only because the American pilot ran out of ammunition. I watched my wingman disintegrate under the Corsair's fire. When I returned to base, my aircraft had 64 bullet holes. Against the Zero's light construction, that should have been impossible, but I made it back, barely. From that day, I knew the war was lost. An aircraft that could absorb that much damage and still kill my wingman was beyond our ability to counter. The Americans had more of everything, more planes, more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition, and the Corsair was better than anything we had. Some of my fellow pilots still argue that the Zero was the superior aircraft in a turning fight. This is true but irrelevant. The Americans didn't turn with us. They didn't have to. They used their strengths and negated ours. That's not just good tactics, that's good thinking. We should have learned from this, but by the time we understood, it was too late. The legacy of the Corsair extends beyond its combat record. The aircraft represented a design philosophy that would define American fighters for generations. Rugged construction, powerful engines, heavy armament, and performance at altitude became hallmarks of American fighter design. The tactics developed by Marine pilots in the South Pacific, boom and zoom attacks using speed and altitude advantage, became doctrine that persisted through the jet age. But perhaps the most significant legacy was psychological. The Corsair's dominance demonstrated that initial impressions could be deceiving, that what appeared flawed might actually be brilliant, and that persistence through early problems could yield tremendous rewards. The aircraft that had been rejected by the Navy as unsuitable for carriers became one of history's greatest carrier fighters. The fighter that Japanese pilots had mocked became the aircraft they feared most. At the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, Florida, a restored F4U Corsair sits in a place of honor among other legendary Navy aircraft. Its distinctive inverted gull wings, the bent configuration that had seemed so strange in 1943, now appear natural, even beautiful. The museum placard lists its specifications and combat achievements, but the real story is told by a piece of captured Japanese intelligence report displayed nearby. The document, dated November 1944 and translated after the war, contains assessments of American fighters. The entry for the Corsair is stark. F4U Corsair, inverted gull wing fighter, extremely dangerous at all altitudes, superior speed, climb and firepower. Avoid engagement when possible. If engagement unavoidable, attack only with numerical superiority of at least 3-1. Do not attempt turning combat. Do not attempt to follow in climbs. Extremely resistant to battle damage. Pilots should assume any hit achieved will not result in kill. Breaking contact requires full power dive, but Corsair can follow and may catch slower aircraft. Assessment: most dangerous American fighter currently deployed. Survival probability in equal numbers engagement. Poor. Below this sobering assessment is a handwritten note, added by an unknown Japanese intelligence officer. Our pilots call this aircraft Whistling Death. The name is appropriate. When you hear the whistle, death is coming, and there is no escape. The Corsair's bent wings, initially mocked as a design flaw, had become a symbol of American air power and Japanese defeat. Those wings, carefully engineered to solve complex problems, represented the triumph of scientific thinking over conventional wisdom. They demonstrated that sometimes the solution to impossible requirements looks strange precisely because it's solving problems in new ways. The production numbers told their own story of American industrial might. Chance Vought, Goodyear and Brewster produced 12,571 Corsairs during the war. At peak production in early 1945, new Corsairs were rolling off assembly lines at a rate of more than 400 per month. Each aircraft represented thousands of hours of skilled labour, tons of strategic materials, and complex manufacturing processes, yet they were being produced faster than Japanese factories could build simple trainers. The ammunition consumption was equally staggering. Each Corsair carried 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, 400 rounds per gun. With hundreds of Corsairs flying daily combat missions, ammunition expenditure exceeded millions of rounds per week. The United States was producing ammunition faster than pilots could fire it, a luxury Japanese pilots could only dream about. By 1945, Japanese fighters often flew with reduced ammunition loads due to shortages. American Corsairs never faced this problem. The maintenance support was revolutionary. Each Corsair squadron was supported by dedicated ground crews trained specifically on the aircraft. Parts were standardized and interchangeable. Damaged aircraft could be repaired quickly, using components from other aircraft or fresh from supply. The Navy's logistics chain ensured that spare engines, propellers, instruments, and structural components were always available. Japanese maintenance, by contrast, was a nightmare of cannibalization and improvisation, with aircraft grounded for weeks waiting for parts that would never arrive. The pilot replacement system was equally impressive. When a Corsair pilot was lost to combat, accident, or completion of tour, a replacement arrived within days, fully trained and ready for combat. These replacements had hundreds of hours of flight time and are trained on the exact aircraft they would fly in combat. Japanese replacement pilots, when available at all, often arrived with barely enough training to take off and land, let alone fight effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bauer, commanding officer of VMF 212, wrote in a September 1943 report to Marine Aviation Headquarters about the systematic advantages American pilots enjoyed. Our success against the Japanese is not primarily about individual aircraft performance. Though the Corsair is superior, it's about the entire system. Our pilots arrive well-trained, our aircraft are well-maintained, our ammunition is unlimited, our fuel is abundant, our tactics are sound and constantly refined based on combat experience. Our intelligence tells us where the enemy is and what to expect. Our logistics ensure we can sustain operations indefinitely. The Japanese have brave pilots and decent aircraft, but they're operating within a system that's failing. They can't train pilots fast enough. They can't maintain their aircraft properly. They're running out of fuel and ammunition. Their tactics haven't evolved beyond 1942. Every advantage we have is multiplied by every other advantage, creating overwhelming superiority. The Corsair is an excellent weapon, but it's the system that makes it deadly. Bauer was killed in action 2 months later, shot down while defending Guadalcanal in his Corsair. But his assessment proved prophetic. By 1944, the systematic advantages he described had created a situation where Japanese defeat was inevitable. American air superiority was so complete that Japanese aircraft were rarely seen. When they did appear, they were destroyed so quickly that encounters barely qualified as combat. The transformation of the Corsair from problem-plagued prototype to dominant fighter took less than 2 years. This rapid evolution demonstrated American ability to identify problems, develop solutions, and implement changes quickly. The contrast with Japanese development was stark. Japan entered the war with excellent aircraft like the Zero, but failed to develop effective replacements. By 1945, Japanese pilots were still flying updated versions of the Zero against Corsairs that had evolved through multiple variants, each more capable than the last. The F4U-4, the ultimate wartime Corsair variant, was so superior to the F4U-1 that had entered service in 1943 that they were almost different aircraft. More powerful engine, better aerodynamics, improved armament options including 4 20mm cannon on some variants, greatly enhanced performance at all altitudes. Yet they were produced on the same assembly lines using the same basic tooling, demonstrating American manufacturing flexibility. The F4U-5 variant, developed late in the war but not widely deployed before Japanese surrender, pushed performance even further. With a 2-stage supercharged engine and other refinements, the Dash 5 could reach 470 miles per hour and climb to 50,000 feet. This was piston engine fighter performance that approached the theoretical limits of the technology. The bent wings that had seemed so odd in 1943 were now attached to what was arguably the finest piston engine fighter ever built. But even as the Corsair reached its peak, the jet age was arriving. The first American jet fighters entered service in 1945, representing the future of air combat. The Corsair, for all its excellence, was a culmination of piston engine technology, not the beginning of a new era. Yet the aircraft would continue serving for another decade. demonstrating that even as technology advanced, a well-designed conventional aircraft still had tremendous value. The Korean War proved this emphatically. When North Korean forces invaded South Korea in June 1950, the United States found itself in a new war with jet aircraft still relatively scarce. The Corsair, already being phased out of frontline service, was rushed back into combat. Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons deployed to Korea in July 1950, less than 5 years after World War II ended. The Corsairs flying over Korea in 1950 were primarily F4U4 and F4U5 variants, the most advanced versions. They faced Soviet-built aircraft including the Yak-9 and later the MiG-15 jet fighter. Against piston-engine opponents, Corsairs dominated just as they had against Japanese fighters. Against jets, they were outmatched in performance, but still dangerous in the hands of skilled pilots. The first Corsair air-to-air kill in Korea came on July 10, 1950, when Lieutenant Commander William Lamb of VF-53, flying from USS Valley Forge, shot down a North Korean Yak-9 fighter. The engagement followed the same pattern that had worked in World War II. Altitude advantage, diving attack, superior firepower, quick kill. The Yak pilot never had a chance to exploit his aircraft's maneuverability advantage, but Korea quickly became a ground attack war for Corsairs. The close air support role they had pioneered at Iwo Jima and Okinawa became their primary mission. Corsairs could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs or rockets, a larger weapons load than World War II medium bombers. They could deliver this ordnance with precision, loitering over the battlefield for hours, responding to calls from forward air controllers supporting troops in contact. The effectiveness of Corsair close air support in Korea earned praise from Army commanders who had been sceptical about close air support effectiveness. Major General Frank Lowe, serving as special observer for President Truman, wrote in an August 1950 report, "The Marine Corsairs are providing the most effective close air support I have ever witnessed. They operate within 50 yards of our front lines, attacking enemy positions that are pinning down our troops. The accuracy is remarkable. The response time from request to ordnance on target is measured in minutes. The psychological effect on enemy troops is significant. They are terrified of the Corsairs. Our troops, by contrast, are emboldened knowing the Corsairs are overhead. This is not strategic bombing. This is flying artillery with precision that exceeds any ground-based artillery system. The Corsair's rugged construction proved valuable in Korea just as it had in the Pacific. The aircraft absorbed tremendous battle damage from ground fire and continued flying. The R2800 engine shrugged off hits that would have stopped less robust power plants. Pilots returned from missions with aircraft shot full of holes, engines running rough, controls damaged, yet still flying. Captain Jesse Fulmar, flying with VMF 312, returned from a close air support mission near the Chosin Reservoir in December 1950 with his Corsair heavily damaged by ground fire. The engine had taken multiple hits and was losing power. The left wing had holes from a 37mm anti-aircraft gun. The rudder was partially shot away. Fulmar managed to reach friendly territory and crash-landed on a beach. He walked away uninjured. His comment to the recovery team echoed sentiments from World War II. The Corsair is the toughest aircraft ever built. This thing took a beating that should have killed me and brought me home. I'll fly it anytime, anywhere. But the appearance of MiG-15 jet fighters in November 1950 changed the air combat environment dramatically. The MiG, with its swept wings and jet engine, was 150 miles per hour faster than the Corsair and could climb to altitudes the piston engine fighter couldn't reach. In a straight performance comparison, the MiG was vastly superior, yet Corsairs managed to shoot down several MiGs through tactics and opportunistic engagements. Captain Jesse Fulmar, the same pilot who had crash-landed the damaged Corsair weeks earlier, scored the first Corsair kill against a MiG-15 on September 10, 1952. Fulmar was leading a ground attack mission when 4 MiGs attacked. Instead of fleeing, Fulmar turned into the attack and opened fire on the lead MiG. The jet pilot, expecting the slow piston engine fighter to be easy prey, was caught off guard by the aggressive maneuver. Fulmar's fire hit the MiG's wing root, causing catastrophic damage. The jet went down out of control. Fulmar's combat report noted that the MiG pilot had made a critical error by getting slow trying to follow the Corsair's turn. The MiG is much faster, but in a slow-speed turning fight, my Corsair had the advantage. The jet couldn't maintain speed in the turn. When he slowed down trying to get his nose around, I was able to get guns on him. At slow speed, the Corsair's guns were just as effective against a jet as against a piston-engine fighter. The MiG came apart just like a Zero would have. The Corsair kill against a MiG-15 represented old technology defeating new through pilot skill and tactical awareness. But such victories were rare. In general, jet fighters were replacing piston-engine aircraft throughout the 1950s. The Corsair's day was ending. The last American Corsairs were retired from active service in 1954, though some continued flying with reserve units and foreign air forces for several more years. The final combat mission flown by a US Corsair was in 1964, when a French Navy F4U-7 operating from the carrier Arromanches flew a strike mission during operations off North Africa. By then, the Corsair was a relic, an aircraft from a previous technological era still capable of effective service in the right circumstances. When production ended in 1952, 12,171 Corsairs had been built, making it one of the longest production runs for any fighter aircraft. The design that had first flown in 1940 remained in production for 12 years, constantly updated and refined, but fundamentally the same aircraft. Those bent wings, which had seemed so strange in 1943, had proven to be timeless. The cost in human terms was recorded in squadron histories and individual stories. Of the thousands of pilots who flew Corsairs in combat, hundreds never returned. Some were shot down in air combat, others were hit by ground fire. Some died in training accidents or operational mishaps. The Corsair, for all its ruggedness, couldn't protect pilots from every threat. But the vast majority of Corsair pilots survived and came home, often crediting their aircraft with saving their lives. The rugged construction, powerful engine, and effective armour protection that had allowed pilots to survive damage that would have been fatal in lighter aircraft saved countless lives over the aircraft's service life. In 1991, at a symposium on Pacific War aviation held at the Naval War College, historians and veterans gathered to discuss the factors that led to American victory. The Corsair was extensively discussed. Japanese veterans, now elderly men, spoke with continuing respect about the bent-wing fighter that had destroyed their air force. American veterans spoke with affection about the aircraft that had carried them through combat. Commander Iwataro Iwai, a former Japanese fighter pilot who had survived the war, offered a perspective that captured the lasting impact of the Corsair. In 1943 we were confident. We had been fighting for years. We had excellent aircraft and experienced pilots. We believed we would defeat the Americans through superior skill and fighting spirit. Then the Corsair arrived. At first, we laughed. The design looked flawed. The bent wings seemed wrong. But after our first encounters, we stopped laughing. The Corsair showed us that we had been thinking about air combat incorrectly. We believed in lightweight aircraft, maneuverability, and pilot skill. The Americans showed us that power, speed, and firepower could defeat maneuverability. They showed us that systematic training could overcome individual skill. They showed us that industrial capacity could overwhelm fighting spirit. The Corsair was the symbol of this philosophy. It was heavy, powerful, rugged, and mass-produced. Everything we were not. By 1944, we knew we had lost. The sky belonged to the Corsairs. We could hear them coming, that distinctive whistle. We knew death was approaching. Many of my friends died hearing that sound. I survived because I learned to run when I heard the whistle. There's no shame in admitting the enemy had a superior weapon. The Corsair was superior. It was one of the best fighters of the war. Those bent wings that we mocked carried a weapon system that destroyed us. The symposium concluded with a tour of the museum's collection, which included a restored F4U-1A Corsair. The Japanese and American veterans walked around the aircraft together, former enemies now friends, examining the bent wings and powerful engine, discussing tactics and remembering battles fought decades earlier. Several Japanese veterans asked to sit in the cockpit, something they'd never done during the war. One veteran, after climbing down, commented to a Marine pilot who had flown Corsairs, "Now I understand. From inside, you could see everything. The visibility is much better than I thought. And all those instruments, you had information we never had. This is not just an aircraft. This is a complete weapon system. We were fighting with swords against men with machine guns." The restoration and preservation of Corsairs became a focus for aviation enthusiasts in the decades after the war. The distinctive bent wings made the aircraft instantly recognizable, a symbol of American air power in World War II and Korea. Today, dozens of flyable Corsairs exist, maintained by collectors and museums, performing at air shows where crowds still thrill to the sound of the R-2800 engine and that distinctive whistle in a high-speed pass. The engineering brilliance of the bent wing design is now universally recognised. What seemed strange in 1943 is now understood as an elegant solution to complex requirements. The inverted gull wing allowed the use of the largest practical propeller with the shortest practical landing gear, maximising both power and structural strength. It reduced drag at the wing root junction, improving performance. It looked distinctive, making the aircraft immediately recognisable. Form followed function perfectly. Modern fighter design still reflects principles established by aircraft like the Corsair. The emphasis on power, speed, and firepower over manoeuvrability became standard. The importance of rugged construction and survivability was validated. The value of versatility, being able to perform multiple missions effectively, became a requirement. Every modern fighter can trace aspects of its design philosophy to lessons learned in World War II, many of them validated by Corsair combat experience. The bent wings of the Corsair represented more than just an engineering solution. They symbolised American willingness to think differently, to challenge conventional wisdom, to pursue solutions that looked wrong but worked perfectly. They demonstrated that initial mockery could transform into respect and fear through performance and results. Japanese pilots who had laughed at the Corsair's appearance in 1943 learned by painful experience that the bent wings carried death. The whistle that accompanied diving Corsairs became the last sound thousands of Japanese pilots heard. The concentrated fire from 6 50-caliber machine guns destroyed over 2,000 Japanese aircraft, ending careers, lives, and ultimately Japanese hopes for victory. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Vought F4U Corsair represented two different approaches to the same problem, creating dominant American fighters. The Thunderbolt was brute force engineering, overwhelming power and firepower in a massive package. The Corsair was elegant engineering, careful optimization of every component to create a balanced weapon system. Both succeeded brilliantly. Together they destroyed Axis air power and established American air supremacy. The legacy of the Corsair extends into the jet age and beyond. Modern carrier fighters still face the same challenges that Rex Beasel confronted in 1938, how to maximize performance while meeting the unique requirements of carrier operations. The solutions differ, catapults and arrested landings replacing the simpler operations of the 1940s, but the fundamental challenge remains. The Corsair proved that radical thinking could solve seemingly impossible problems, a lesson that continues resonating in aerospace engineering. At the National Museum of Naval Aviation, visitors pause before the restored Corsair, examining those bent wings, trying to understand how something that looked so wrong proved so right. Children ask their parents why the wings are bent. Adults explain the engineering, the propeller clearance, the structural efficiency. But the real answer is simpler. The wings are bent because that's what victory required. American engineers bent them, American workers built them, American pilots flew them, and Japanese pilots learned to fear them. The Corsair's story is ultimately about transformation. An aircraft declared unsuitable became indispensable. A design mocked became legendary. Bent wings that seemed flawed became the symbol of American air power. In less than 2 years, the Corsair transformed from problem to solution, from liability to asset, from laughingstock to legend. Japanese pilots who survived the war carried memories of the Corsair for the rest of their lives. Many reported nightmares about that distinctive whistle, dreams of diving fighters with bent wings and concentrated streams of fire. The psychological scars outlasted the physical war, a testament to the Corsair's effectiveness as a weapon of terror as well as destruction. The last word belongs to Saburo Sakai, the Japanese ace who encountered Corsairs throughout the Pacific War and survived to tell the story. In his final interview before his death in 2000, he was asked what aircraft he respected most from World War II. His answer was immediate. The Corsair. Without question, the Corsair. It had everything. Speed, power, firepower, ruggedness. It could fight at any altitude. It could bomb. It could strafe. It could dogfight when necessary. But most of all, it had those bent wings that made it unmistakable. When you saw that silhouette, you knew you were facing the best fighter in the Pacific. We mocked those wings at first. By the end, we feared them. The Corsair represented everything we lacked: American industrial power, engineering excellence, systematic thinking. We had courage and skill, but that wasn't enough against such a weapon. The bent wings haunted my dreams for decades after the war. Even now, when I see pictures of a Corsair, I remember the fear, the whistling sound, the incredible firepower. It was the perfect fighter for the war that was fought. We were wrong to mock it. We paid for that mistake with thousands of lives and ultimate defeat. The Corsair's bent wings, initially derided as evidence of flawed design, proved to be the mark of excellence. They carried American pilots to victory, across the vast Pacific, destroyed Japanese air power, and established a legend that endures 8 decades later. The Japanese pilots who mocked the Corsair in 1943 learned the hardest possible lesson. Never judge a weapon by its appearance. Judge it by what it can do. And what the Corsair could do was own the sky.